Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 55 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Arizona Coyotes, in which the Sharks have lost 5-4 in overtime. This being the second to last game of the season for the San Jose Sharks and the final game of the season for the Arizona Coyotes. We actually ended up getting a pretty fun one at that. This is the 8th and final meeting between these two teams, and the first 7 meetings were, give or take, I would say, not usually the most fun games when the Sharks actually end up against the Arizona Coyotes, because the Coyotes play in a bit more of a defensive style of game. But in this being their final game of the season, one that was essentially meaningless for them, they were pretty much locked in to where they currently are in the standings unless the Kings can make something happen, though probably not. And as such, this game really opened up a bit and actually ended up being a pretty enjoyable one. The Sharks actually setting their season high in terms of shots with the game here tonight at 48. And this first period starts off pretty well for the Coyotes. The first few minutes of this one, they score the first goal of the game from Christian Dvorak. The Sharks, a few minutes later, would be able to tie it up with a Rudolf Balcers goal. Then the Coyotes would get another on the power play. That would be Christian Dvorak again to make it 2-1, before the Sharks would, a couple minutes later, tie it up once more with Kevin Labanc. And at the end of the first period, it would be 2-2. And probably not exactly the score that the Sharks were hoping to emerge from that first period with, considering the Sharks were the pretty significantly better team in that first period, but nonetheless, I guess a tie game wasn't too bad. In the second period, the Sharks would get their first lead of the game as Timo Meier would score to make it 3-2, but the Coyotes, with Yannick's second career goal in his second straight game, would tie it up, and we would have a still tie score going into the third. And the game would remain tied at 3 for the majority of the third period until about 4 minutes to go, where Connor Garland would make a nice move and put it past Melnichuk in his first career NHL game to make it 4-3 Coyotes, and it looked like that might be the regulation score to end this game. But in the dying seconds of the third period, less than a minute to go, it would be, of course, who else but Barabanov who would score the game-tying goal and get this one to overtime, potentially the Sharks' final overtime game of the season. And honestly, if there's anything that I've learned from this season from the San Jose Sharks, it would be that their 3-on-3 performance is not very good at all. I don't know if it's a lack of chemistry, a lack of coordination between the players who happen to be on the ice for the Sharks, but the 3-on-3s are almost always quite bad from the Sharks' perspective, and that kind of continued here. While they had some possession, they never really got too much of a chance on net, and eventually it would be Phil Kessel who would score his 10th goal of the season against the Sharks and his 20th goal in general to put the Sharks away and leave them with just the single point, even though that, again, doesn't really matter at all. So the first thing to talk about would be Melnichuk. As I said, this is his first career NHL game, and he was probably hoping for a bit of a better performance in this one. Obviously, it never really feels good to give up this game-winning goal in overtime, especially when it is a weak goal. I mean, just ask Martin Jones a few games ago. Otherwise, in the 4 regulation goals, a couple were not ones that he didn't have too much of a chance on. The Garland one was a great move by Garland. The second Christian Dvorak one was a tough one from in close. The first one from Dvorak was one he probably could have had. The third one from Yannick is honestly a difficult one to evaluate. Yannick tries to go short side, or at least the puck ends up going short side here, but it feels like it kind of bounced on Yannick, and he wasn't intentionally trying to pick this corner, and yet kind of got lucky in this situation that the corner ended up being picked. So it's one of those things that it is, I guess, a bad goal from Melnichuk, but also just kind of an unlucky bounce in general. I guess in totality, however, not the best performance here in his first NHL game for Melnichuk. So anyone who's expecting a Carey Price level performance from either of the two Sharks young goaltenders here down the stretch is probably left disappointed a bit. Melnichuk still a very, very, very small sample size with just the single game, so we can't really draw any sort of crazy conclusions from him. When it comes to Koshinash, who will probably get the final game of the season on Wednesday against the Vegas Golden Knights, I would say, while I'm obviously not Carey Price level, as I pointed out, he does look to be at least somewhat promising, and we'll see what the Sharks actually decide to roll with going into the following season in terms of goaltending. Next, I'll talk about Brynns Pasichnuk again. In the previous game yesterday, I mentioned that he had a very, very bad one in my opinion, and I felt as though that he wasn't seemingly NHL ready just yet, and he probably wouldn't play either of these final 2 games of the season. Well, in the end, I was wrong. I continue to not really be able to understand what Bob Booner's thought process is from game to game, and Pasichnuk actually gets the game here tonight. And honestly, I guess I will eat my words a bit, but not a ton. I thought Pasichnuk did look better here tonight, had a couple of pretty nice shifts. One in particular, I thought he had a couple of good looks offensively. He didn't seem to be as lost here defensively tonight. It still wasn't a super impressive game. It's still nothing that I'd say, wow, Pasichnuk really looking all that good. But I guess it was an improvement from his previous 2 games of the season, and I guess that is all that you can really ask for from a rookie playing their 3rd career NHL game. You just want to see them be able to constantly improve, and Pasichnuk, with this one at the very least, has done so. Next, I'll be talking about Noah Gregor, a very interesting young forward for the San Jose Sharks this season. So obviously, I've been talking a lot at times this year, at least in the past few weeks, about Barabanov. I'm saying, oh, he's really looking like a solid forward for the San Jose Sharks. Could potentially be a second liner for the Sharks in the future. Maybe first line if the Sharks can't really fill out a strong top 6. Rudolf Balcers similarly could definitely be a second line forward for the San Jose Sharks in the future, or at least an extremely strong third liner, but that's not necessarily the I guess ceiling that every prospect in the NHL needs to shoot for. Some prospects were kind of just built to be in that bottom 6 and do a good job at that, and that is exactly what Noah Gregor seems to be. I thought here tonight he used his speed very, very effectively, had a lot of really good chances off of the rush. His shots were not really going in. His shots were not super deadly here tonight, but I liked the speed, I liked the moves, and he showed off a good amount of skill. So as I said, I'm not expecting Gregor to be a top 6 forward in the future for the San Jose Sharks, but I am expecting him to at least become a very solid 4th liner, if not a pretty solid 3rd liner. And I think here tonight is sort of a good show of what we can expect, or hopefully expect, from Noah Gregor moving on into the following season, where he likely still will remain with the Sharks. And finally, let's talk about Timo Meier. The past few games, I've been mentioning some of these more longer-term players for the San Jose Sharks on some longer-term contracts. I've brought up Hertl, Kane, Carlson. Here tonight, I will bring up Timo Meier. I mentioned already a few games ago that Meier has been the most disappointing player for the San Jose Sharks this season. I still don't think that has necessarily changed here as we come down the final stretch of games this season, with just now 1 more left on Wednesday. However, I do think Meier has been finishing the season strong, similarly to how I mentioned that about Erik Karlsson last game. Meier has looked more improved in these past couple of games, and he scored a goal here tonight that was very reminiscent of classic Timo Meier from a couple years ago, when he was looking like that, emerging forward on the scene of the NHL. Because remember, it was just 2 years ago he had that crazy career year, 30 goals, over 60 points. And then in the offseason of that year, the Sharks ended up signing him to a 4-year deal worth $6 million per year. And all of the fans outside of San Jose were thinking, wow, what a crazy steal to sign him up for that much time. And it felt as though Meier was giving a pretty team-friendly deal for the San Jose Sharks. All of his sort of advanced stats were backing up that he was a player who was, very, very effective. And it was essentially a move that Meier was making that would help out the San Jose Sharks without sort of screwing himself down the line, by making it so that in the final year of that 4-year deal, he'd get paid $10 million. So if the Sharks tried to tender a qualifying offer to him at the end of his contract, he could accept it and still be making $10 million for the following year. And so it was essentially a move that, as I said, Meier was doing for the team. And it seemed as though he was going to end up being underpaid at the time. But now, 2 years later, he does not seem to be underpaid. In fact, he does not even seem to be fairly played. And this season, he has been playing at a level at around a $4 million player. And as such, he's been seemingly quite overpaid this year. But as I said, he has finished the season somewhat strong here over these last couple of games. Hopefully, he can have a pretty nice one in the final game of the season against the Vegas Golden Knights. Because obviously, the future for the San Jose Sharks Sharks is up in the air. We do not exactly know what kind of mentality that the Sharks are going to approach next season with. Will it be a season that the Sharks are going to try and make a couple of moves to potentially try and compete in? Or is it going to be another retooling kind of year where the Sharks will be, happy if they can potentially make the playoffs, but won't necessarily be making any sort of push to do so? In the end, however, Meier will be part of the team for the next couple of years, I suspect, since I really hope that the Sharks won't try and move him at the in the offseason this year, because while he is definitely a much more movable player compared to someone like Karlsson that I mentioned in yesterday's review, I feel as though trading him at, pennies on the dollar value that he is currently at is just not a very wise decision to be made by Doug Wilson. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday. As I said, they will take on the Golden Knights for the final time this season in the final game of the season. And the Sharks currently against the Golden Knights are a grand total of 0-7, or I guess there were a couple overtime losses in there. But basically, they have not yet won a game against the Golden Knights this season. And we'll see if they can finish their year on a positive note, or if they'll just take the loss. Class dismissed.